Carter was a trucker. He loved the open road, the quiet nights, and the hum of his 18-wheeler as it rolled through the dark highways. He had been driving trucks for 15 years, delivering everything from fresh produce to electronics. Earl had seen many things on the road: strange lights in the sky, bizarre animals crossing in the dead of night, and even the occasional ghost story from fellow truckers. But he never believed in the supernatural, until one fateful night. Earl was driving a load of furniture from Kansas to Colorado. The route was long but straightforward: stick to Highway 50, cut through the plains, and head up into the mountains. He was behind schedule due to a flat tire earlier that day, and now he was determined to make up time. The clock on his dashboard read 11:15 p.m. as Earl pulled his cap lower over his brow and took a sip of coffee. The highway was nearly empty, stretching endlessly under a black sky speckled with stars. His headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the endless gray ribbon of asphalt ahead. About an hour later, Earl saw a sign. It was old and faded, barely visible in the beam of his headlights. Baker's Hollow, 10 miles. As Earl didn't remember ever passing through Baker's Hollow before. He grabbed his map from the passenger seat during a quick stoplight and checked. There was no Baker's Hollow listed. The GPS on his dashboard was acting up, showing his truck in the middle of a blank screen. Must be one of those old ghost towns, Earl muttered to himself, brushing it off. As the miles passed, the road began to change. The smooth asphalt turned rough and cracked. Weeds poked through the edges, and the trees lining the highway grew thicker, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Earl turned on the high beams, but they barely pierced the growing darkness. He noticed something else. There were no mile markers, no signs, and no other cars. For a while, Earl reassured himself. Just a quiet stretch of road, nothing to worry about, he said out loud, as if hearing his own voice would make it true. Then he saw the figure. It was a man standing at the side of the road. He was tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. Earl's heart skipped a beat, but he told himself it was just a hitchhiker. As he approached, the man lifted an arm to wave. Earl slowed the truck down but didn't stop. Something about the figure made his skin crawl. When he passed the man, Earl glanced in his side mirror. The man was gone. Earl slammed on the brakes and stared into the mirror. The road behind him was empty. Shaking his head, Earl muttered, "I'm just tired, seeing things." He eased his foot back onto the gas and kept driving. A few miles later, Earl saw lights ahead. It was a diner, small and worn, with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered. Maggie's Diner, open. Grateful for a chance to stretch his legs, Earl pulled into the gravel lot and parked his truck. The diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, with checkered floors and red vinyl booths. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a cloth. She looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yeah, and maybe a piece of pie," Earl said, sliding into it. As the waitress poured his coffee, Earl noticed the place was empty. No other customers, no cook in the kitchen. "Quiet night?" he asked. The waitress didn't answer right away. She set the coffee down in front of him, her hand trembling slightly. "You shouldn't be out here this late," she said softly. Earl frowned. "Why's that?" The waitress glanced toward the window. "Strange things happen on this highway after midnight." Earl chuckled, trying to shake off the unease growing in his chest. "Let me guess. Ghost stories to scare the tourists?" She didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned in closer. "If you see a man on the road, don't stop, don't look back." Before Earl could ask what she meant, the lights in the diner flickered. The waitress froze, her eyes darting to the door. Earl turned to look, but saw nothing. When he turned back, the waitress was gone. He stood up, his heart pounding. "Hello, ma'am?" The diner was silent. Even the hum of the neon sign outside had stopped. Earl backed away and bolted out the door, nearly tripping over the gravel as he ran to his truck. He climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and Earl floored it, desperate to put the diner, and whatever was happening, behind him. The highway seemed even darker now, the trees pressing closer. Earl's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then he saw the man again. This time the figure stood in the middle of the road. Earl blared his horn, but the man didn't move. As Earl got closer, he realized the figure wasn't alone. Shadowy shapes stood on either side of the road, dozens of them, all watching him. Earl swerved to avoid the man, the truck skidding slightly on the rough pavement. When he looked in the rearview mirror, the road was empty again. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing. "This isn't real. This isn't real," he repeated. But the radio crackled to life, cutting off his thoughts. A voice came through, distorted and low. "Turn back." Earl grabbed the CB mic. "Who is this? What do you want?" The only response was static. Suddenly the truck's engine sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered, and the truck rolled to a stop. Earl slammed his fists against the steering wheel. Come on," he yelled, turning the key in the ignition. The truck wouldn't start. Earl sat in the cab, surrounded by darkness, listening to the creak of the trees and the distant sound of footsteps. He turned to look out the window, and his blood ran cold. The man in the hat was standing just outside the truck, staring up at him. His face was pale, his eyes black as coal. Earl scrambled for his flashlight and shined it out the window. The man was gone. A loud bang echoed from the back of the truck. Earl whipped around, his heart hammering in his chest. The trailer doors were swinging open, even though he had locked them before leaving the depot. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Earl grabbed a tire iron from under his seat and climbed out of the cab. "Whoever's messing with me, you'd better stop," he shouted, his voice shaking. The air was icy cold, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. Earl approached the back of the truck, the tire iron clutched tightly in his hand. When he reached the trailer, he froze. Inside were rows of coffins, each one open and empty. Earl stumbled back, his mind reeling. The sound of footsteps surrounded him, growing louder, closing in. He turned, and the man in the hat was there, along with the shadowy figures. They stood in a circle around Earl, their faces expressionless, their eyes empty voids. Earl screamed, swinging the tire iron wildly. But his arms felt heavy, his movements slow. The shadows closed in, their cold hands grabbing him, pulling him down. The last thing Earl saw was the man in the hat, leaning over him, a sinister smile spreading across his pale face. The next morning, Earl's truck was found parked neatly on the side of Highway 50. The engine was off, the trailer empty. Earl was never seen again. Some say his ghost still drives the haunted highway, warning other truckers to turn back before it's too late. Earl's disappearance became a mystery that spread among truckers. His fellow drivers shared stories on CB radios late at night, warning each other about the stretch of Highway 50 near Baker's Hollow. Some claimed to have seen Earl's truck, still rolling along the highway, with its lights on but no driver behind the wheel. Others whispered about a man in a wide-brimmed hat and shadowy figures that seemed to come out of nowhere. Months passed, and the story of Earl Carter became one of many legends truckers told to pass the time. But for one man, the tale wasn't just a ghost story. Jake Rogers was a young trucker, just a few years into his career. He had known Earl from the depot and looked up to him like a mentor. Earl had taught Jake how to handle tough roads and survive long nights on the road. When Jake heard about Earl's disappearance, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. One night, Jake found himself assigned to the same route Earl had been driving before he vanished. His dispatcher had assured him it was a safe and routine delivery, but as Jake loaded his truck and looked at the map, a chill ran down his spine. The route included the infamous stretch of Highway 50. Jake debated whether to ask for a different assignment, but his pride got the better of him. "I'm not scared of some old ghost story," he muttered. He left the depot just as the sun was setting, determined to make the trip in record time. For the first few hours, everything was normal. The highway was quiet, the scenery monotonous, and the truck hummed steadily beneath him. But as he approached the area where Earl had vanished, Jake noticed the changes. The road grew rougher, the trees denser, and the air colder. His GPS screen glitched, displaying strange symbols before going dark entirely. Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter, his pulse quickening. He passed the same faded sign Earl had seen, Baker's Hollow 10 miles. Jake felt a shiver but kept driving. The diner appeared, its neon sign flickering weakly. Jake didn't stop. He remembered the stories and kept his eyes on the road, even as he thought he saw a shadowy figure standing in the diner's window. A few miles later, Jake saw the man in the hat. The figure stood on the shoulder of the road, motionless, watching him. Jake's heart pounded, but he didn't slow down. He gritted his teeth and pressed harder on the gas. The man appeared again, this time in the middle of the road. Jake swerved, narrowly avoiding him, and shouted, "Leave me alone." When Jake checked his mirror, the road behind him was empty. The radio crackled and a familiar voice came through. "Jake, turn back." Jake froze. It was Earl's voice. He grabbed the CB mic. "Earl, is that you? Where are you?" The voice answered, distorted and faint. "Don't let them take you. Don't stop, no matter what." Before Jake could respond, the radio went silent. The engine sputtered, and the truck came to a sudden stop. Jake slammed his fists on the dashboard. "Come on, not now." He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab, his breath visible in the freezing air. The darkness was thick, almost suffocating, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under his boots. Jake walked to the front of the truck, shining his light on the engine. As he fiddled with the wires, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. The man in the hat stood a few feet away, flanked by shadowy figures. Jake backed up, his heart racing. "Stay away!" he shouted, but his voice cracked. The figures moved closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Jake scrambled back into the cab, locking the doors. The figures surrounded the truck, their pale hands slapping against the windows. The man in the hat stood in front, smiling. Jake's radio crackled again. "The trailer, open it," Earl's voice said. Jake hesitated, then climbed into the back of the cab and opened the door to the trailer. Inside, he saw rows of coffins, just as Earl had described. But this time, one was different. The lid was partially open, and inside lay Earl Carter. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Earl!" Jake shouted, reaching for him. Earl's eyes flicked to Jake and his lips moved silently. Jake leaned closer, trying to hear him. "Run!" Earl whispered. The trailer door slammed shut and Jake was thrown backward. The truck roared to life, its engine revving loudly. The cab filled with cold, dark energy, and the last thing Jake saw was the man in the hat climbing into the driver's seat, his grin stretching impossibly wide. The next morning, a state trooper found Jake's truck parked neatly at a rest stop along Highway 50. The cab was empty, the engine off. The trailer was locked, and no one could explain how it had arrived there. Jake Rogers was never found. Truckers still talk about the haunted highway, warning each other to avoid it at all costs. They say Earl's truck still appears on foggy nights, followed closely by another truck with no driver. And if you see the man in the hat, don't stop, don't look back. Some roads, they say, are better left untraveled. Years passed, and the legend of the haunted highway only grew. Truckers avoided Highway 50 whenever they could, especially the stretch near Baker's Hollow. But curiosity has a way of drawing people to the unknown, and not everyone heeds the warnings. Laura Daniels was a freelance journalist with a taste for the bizarre. She had written stories about haunted houses, UFO sightings, and unsolved murders. When she stumbled upon the story of Earl Carter and Jake Rogers, she knew she had found her next big feature. Laura wasn't the type to believe in ghosts. To her, the stories were just folklore, exaggerated tales truckers told to entertain each other. But she couldn't deny the chilling pattern of disappearances along that stretch of Highway 50. Armed with a notebook, a recorder, and her old but reliable SUV, Laura set out to uncover the truth. She drove into the night, her headlights slicing through the dark. The road was eerily quiet, and as she approached the infamous stretch of highway, a sense of unease settled over her. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches tangling together to form an oppressive canopy. Her GPS flickered, then went dark. "Typical," Laura muttered, tapping the screen. She wasn't surprised. Cell service had been spotty all night. She passed the faded Baker's Hollow 10 miles sign, the words barely visible under a layer of grime. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Just a creepy old road," she said out loud. as if hearing her own voice would keep the fear at bay. A few miles later, the diner came into view. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the gravel lot. Laura pulled in, her curiosity piqued. She grabbed her recorder and stepped out of the SUV, the crunch of gravel loud in the still night. The diner looked abandoned, yet the neon sign still flickered. She pushed open the door, and the bell above it jingled softly. Inside, the air was stale. The booths were coated in dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. Laura ran her fingers over the counter, leaving a clean streak in the grime. "This place hasn't been open in years," she murmured, flipping on her recorder. A faint sound made her pause. It was a soft hum, like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the empty diner. The hum stopped. Laura's heart raced as she turned toward the window. Outside, under the flickering neon light, stood a man in a wide-brimmed hat. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak. He just stared at her. Laura fumbled for her camera, snapping a picture through the dusty glass. But when she lowered the camera, the man was gone. Her hands trembled as she reviewed the photo. The frame was empty, showing only the neon sign and the gravel lot. "Okay, that's weird," she whispered, shoving the camera back into her bag. Laura bolted out of the diner and climbed into her SUV, locking the doors. She started the engine and peeled out of the lot, her tires kicking up gravel. As she drove, the air inside the car grew colder. The radio crackled, and a deep voice filled the cabin. "Turn back." Laura's blood ran cold. "Who is this? How are you on my radio?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the radio emitted a low, distorted laugh. Suddenly, her headlights illuminated a figure in the middle of the road. Laura slammed on the brakes, the SUV skidding to a stop. The man in the hat stood before her, his pale face lit by her high beams. His eyes were black pits, and his lips curled into a sinister smile. Laura threw the SUV into reverse, her tires squealing as she backed away. But when she glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart stopped. Shadowy figures lined the road behind her, their empty eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel. The figures began to move, closing in on her vehicle. Laura floored the gas, swerving around the man in the hat and barreling down the road. Her hands shook as she gripped the wheel, her pulse pounding in her ears. The SUV's engine roared, but the shadows seemed to keep pace, their forms darting alongside the vehicle like wraiths. Suddenly, her headlights illuminated a truck parked on the shoulder. It was an old wheeler, its paint faded and its trailer door swinging open. Laura's eyes widened as she recognized the name on the side, Carter Logistics. "That's Earl's truck," she whispered. The shadows slowed as she passed the truck, almost as if they were afraid to get too close. Laura didn't hesitate. She drove on, her heart racing, until the road smoothed out and the trees thinned. When she finally reached a rest stop, she pulled over and jumped out of the SUV, her legs trembling. She spent the rest of the night recording her experience, determined to share the truth about Highway 50. But when Laura returned home and reviewed her footage, she found nothing. The photos were blank, the audio was static, and her notes seemed incomplete, as if parts of her memory had been erased. Still, she wrote her story, warning others about the haunted highway. Few believed her, but truckers who had heard the tale before nodded knowingly. And though Laura never returned to Highway 50, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the hat was still watching her. Tom was an experienced truck driver. He'd been driving for years, hauling goods from one city to another. He had driven through all kinds of weather, at all hours of the day and night. But tonight was different. Tonight, something felt off. It was a cold winter night. The kind of night where the wind howled through the trees and the sky was a deep, dark black. Tom had just left a small town and was heading down a lonely highway. He had driven this road hundreds of times, but tonight, the road seemed different. It was quieter, almost too quiet. As he drove, Tom noticed that the usual sounds of the truck seemed muted. The engine wasn't as loud as it usually was, and the tires seemed to glide over the road without making much noise. The radio was silent too. despite Tom turning the dial to every station. The air inside the truck was cold, but it wasn't the kind of cold you would expect in winter. It was a strange, almost unnatural chill that seemed to come from nowhere. Tom shook off the feeling. He had been driving for hours and was starting to feel tired. He needed to stop and stretch his legs. There was a small rest stop coming up, so he decided to pull over. As he parked the truck and stepped out, the wind hit him hard, biting through his jacket. The rest stop was deserted. There were no other trucks or cars in the lot. Tom looked around, but there wasn't a soul in sight. The only thing he could hear was the wind howling through the trees and the distant sound of the highway. Tom didn't like the feeling of being alone out here, but he needed a break. He walked over to the small building that served as the rest stop and went inside. It was dark and cold inside, and there was an eerie silence. The lights flickered for a moment, but then stayed on. He sat on one of the benches, trying to shake off the strange feeling. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. It was the same old story. Out here in the middle of nowhere, you were lucky if you had any signal at all. He stood up to leave, but as he did, he heard something. A soft sound, almost like footsteps, coming from behind him. Tom turned around quickly, but there was no one there. He frowned. Maybe it was just the wind, he thought. He walked back to the truck, the feeling of unease still creeping up his spine. As he climbed into the cab and shut the door, he felt a chill in the air that hadn't been there before. The truck started with a low rumble, but as Tom pulled out of the rest stop and back onto the highway, he noticed something strange. The road seemed even emptier than usual. The headlights cut through the darkness, but there was nothing ahead of him, just endless black. Tom drove on, trying to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. His eyes were heavy, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. He needed to stop and rest, but there wasn't another rest stop for miles. Then, as if out of nowhere, a figure appeared on the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a white dress. Her hair was long and wild, and she stood there, staring at Tom as he drove by. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. Tom slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. He turned the truck around, but when he looked back, the woman was gone. There was nothing on the side of the road but trees and darkness. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, trying to calm himself. "It's just your imagination," he told himself. "You're tired. You need rest." But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Tom kept driving, but the feeling of being watched never left him. The road seemed endless, and the darkness seemed to press in closer with every passing mile. The wind howled, louder now, and the temperature dropped even further. The strange chill in the truck was unbearable. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, and Tom swore under his breath. He tried to turn the high beams back on, but they wouldn't respond. The road was now pitch black, with only the dim glow of the dashboard lights to guide him. He kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the wheel. His heart pounded in his chest. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the highway, blocking his path. Tom slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding across the icy road. The figure didn't move. It was the woman again, standing right in front of him. He was only a few feet away when she suddenly turned her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes were wide and empty, as if she were staring right through him. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Tom slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, and the truck roared to life. He sped past the woman, but just as he did, he heard something, a soft whisper, almost like a voice calling his name. "Tom." He looked in the rearview mirror, but the woman was gone. His hands were sweating as he gripped the wheel. He wasn't sure if he had imagined the whole thing, but something didn't feel right. The highway stretched on, and Tom felt like he was driving in circles. The same trees, the same road signs. It was as if the world around him had frozen in time. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Tom couldn't tell. He had been on the road for so long, and he was starting to feel dizzy. His eyes felt heavy, and he was having trouble keeping them open. That's when he saw something else in the distance, a small light, flickering like a candle. It was far away, but it seemed to be moving, getting closer. Tom's heart raced as the light grew larger. It wasn't a car, but something else. He could see it more clearly now. It was a figure, walking down the highway toward him. He slammed on the brakes, but the truck wouldn't stop. It kept skidding on the icy road, sliding toward the figure. He tried to turn the wheel, but it felt as if the truck wasn't responding to him at all. The figure was now only a few feet away, and Tom could see it clearly. It was a man, dressed in a long coat, with his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't move, just stood there in the middle of the road, waiting for Tom. Tom's heart raced as he tried to stop the truck, but it was no use. The truck hit the man with a deafening crash. Tom felt the impact, heard the horrible sound of metal crunching, but when he looked up, the road was empty again. No sign of the man, no sign of anything. The truck came to a sudden stop. Tom sat frozen, unable to move. His mind raced, but his body was paralyzed with fear. He had to get out of the truck. He had to find out what had just happened. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The wind whipped around him, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. He looked down at the road, expecting to see the man's body, but there was nothing. The road was completely empty. That's when he heard it again. The whisper, "Tom." He turned, his eyes wide, and saw the woman standing behind him. Her face was pale and twisted, her eyes glowing in the darkness. She was smiling at him, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile filled with malice. Tom screamed and ran back to the truck, his legs weak with fear. He jumped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. But the truck wouldn't start. The lights flickered, and the engine sputtered, but it didn't turn over. He looked out the window, and the woman was gone. But the whisper continued, getting louder and louder. "Tom." Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he turned the key again. This time, the engine roared to life. He slammed the truck into gear and sped down the highway, not looking back. The whispering continued, but he didn't dare stop. For the rest of the night, Tom drove without stopping, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Every time he looked behind him, he expected to see the woman, or the man, or something worse. When he finally reached the next town, he was shaking with fear. He pulled into a gas station and sat there for a moment, trying to calm himself. He didn't know what had happened out there on that road, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never drive that highway again. And as he sat there, looking out into the darkness, he could still hear the whisper echoing in his mind. Tom. Tom sat in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, his heart still pounding from the horrifying events he had just experienced. The whisper in his mind wouldn't stop, and the memory of the woman's pale face and empty eyes haunted him. He glanced nervously around the gas station, hoping to see something normal, something that would reassure him that he was safe. But the night felt wrong. The street lights flickered, and the wind howled in the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He stared at the gas station attendant's window, but there was no sign of life. No cars passed by, and the darkness outside felt even deeper than before. It was as if the entire world had gone silent, frozen in time. Tom decided he couldn't stay here any longer. He needed to get away from this place. He needed to find a way to forget everything that had happened on that highway. He started the truck, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and he slowly pulled out of the station, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. The road ahead seemed deserted, just as it had been when he first began his journey. But this time, the highway felt different, like a dark, endless tunnel that he couldn't escape. As he drove, the familiar stretch of highway that he had traveled countless times now felt like a nightmare. The trees that lined the road seemed to close in, their branches twisting and reaching like long fingers. The white lines on the road blurred, and everything ahead of him seemed to ripple, as if the world itself was shifting. Tom glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see something. The image of the woman, the ghostly figure standing in the road, flashed through his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about her eyes, empty and glowing. What had she wanted? Why had she appeared to him? He couldn't stay on this road any longer. But as he pressed his foot on the accelerator, he saw something up ahead. It was a shape, dark, indistinct, blocking the road in the distance. He slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out what it was. The closer he got, the more he realized it was another person standing in the middle of the road. This time, it wasn't a woman. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood and a long coat. He stood completely still, like a statue, not moving a muscle. Tom's heart raced as he slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt just in time. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. The man didn't even acknowledge the truck's approach, didn't flinch as the vehicle stopped inches away from him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, just as Tom began to roll down his window, the man spoke in a voice that was soft but eerily clear. "You can't escape," he said, his voice cold as ice. "The road won't let you leave." Tom froze, his body paralyzed by fear. The man's words echoed in his mind, and for a moment, he couldn't even move. How could this stranger know what had happened? How could he possibly understand? The man stepped closer to the truck, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he watched the figure approach. His eyes were wide, his mind screaming for him to drive away, but his body refused to obey. The figure came to a stop beside the truck. Tom could now see his face, pale and drawn, his eyes dark and hollow. It was as if the man was made of shadows, his features distorted and unnatural. The more Tom looked at him, the more he realized that the man wasn't alive, at least not in the way he understood it. "You have crossed into the wrong place, trucker," the man said, his voice growing darker with every word. "This highway is cursed, and you, like all the others, are trapped." Tom's breath caught in his throat. He had heard rumors about strange things happening on this road, but he had never believed them. Now, standing face to face with this eerie figure, he realized the truth. Before Tom could speak, the man reached out, his cold hand pressing against the truck's window. Tom recoiled, his body trembling, as the air around him grew unbearably cold. "Leave while you still can," the man whispered, "before she comes for you." A sudden gust of wind slammed into the truck, shaking it violently. Tom's vision blurred as the world around him seemed to twist and distort. The man's form flickered in the air like a mirage, and just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. Tom's heart raced as he looked around frantically. The road was empty again, the man nowhere to be seen. He slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, speeding down the highway. But as he drove, the highway seemed to stretch on forever. The trees seemed to move, bending toward the truck, as if they were closing in on him. The road twisted and turned in unnatural ways, and the darkness seemed to grow thicker with every mile. The headlights flickered, then went out entirely, leaving Tom in pitch blackness. He slammed on the brakes, panic rising in his chest. He had to stop. He couldn't see. The truck skidded to a halt, and Tom sat frozen, gasping for air, trying to calm his racing heart. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then he heard it, the whisper. It came from all around him, as if the darkness itself was speaking to him. Tom. He looked out the window, his breath fogging up the glass. He saw nothing at first, but then, in the distance, he saw a faint light, flickering like a candle, the same light from before. But this time, it wasn't far away. It was much closer. Closer than he could ever have imagined. The truck's engine roared to life, as if responding to the whisper. The light in the distance grew brighter, and Tom's eyes widened in horror as he realized what was happening. The light wasn't a person. It was the figure of the woman, the one he had seen earlier. She was standing at the edge of the road, her hair wild and her eyes glowing, her face twisted in an unnatural grin. Tom tried to put the truck in gear, but the gears wouldn't shift. His heart pounded in his chest as he pressed harder on the gas, but the truck wouldn't move. It was as if the vehicle itself had become part of the nightmare, trapped on the road with no way out. The woman's figure came closer and closer, her eyes fixed on Tom. The whisper grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. "Tom, you belong here now." Suddenly, the truck lurched forward, slamming into something. The headlights flared to life, and Tom looked around in a panic. The woman was gone. The road was clear again. He couldn't breathe. His vision was blurry, and he felt dizzy, as if the world was spinning out of control. The truck came to a stop, and Tom fell back into his seat, gasping for air. He could barely process what had just happened. The road was silent now. The trees were still. Everything seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened. But Tom knew better. He knew that he wasn't free, not yet. He looked at the horizon, but all he saw was more endless highway stretching into the darkness. There was no turning back now. He was stuck here, in this place forever. And in the back of his mind, he heard it again, the whisper, "Tom, it would never stop."